Good morning, everyone. I'm Richard Holloway, and I've been asked to introduce and chair this interesting event today. I hope it's not going to be too bland. I hope there's not going to be too profound a search for agreement between the different sides, Christianity and humanism, because that won't be any fun at all. And there's always a tendency to stress continuities and congruence rather than difference and disagreement. And difference and disagreement are usually much more interesting to listen to. There is one big disagreement, of course, which is the status and meaning of God. But even that subject is disagreed about in Christianity. I mean, John Hick's famous typology of realists who believe in a real God, of critical realists who believe there is a real God, but they're not sure whether they've got him right, and non-realists who believe that God is a human invention, but a useful one, that helps us understand our own nature and the moral imperatives under which we live. There are similar discontinuities and disagreements within humanism. I mean, there are atheistic humanists, there are agnostic humanists, there are humanists who hate religion, and there are humanists who in fact admire and respect it and steal quite a few of its deals, because one of the things I've noticed recently is that while it's easy to get rid of God, it's less easy to get rid of the church. And the assembly movement has recreated the church. It has Sunday morning services. It has sermons. The guy who founded it, a stand-up comedian, came to see me because he wanted advice on how to handle what was happening pastorally. He turned into a bishop of the atheist movement, and people were coming to him for spiritual and moral advice. I offered to lay my hands on him and ordain him for the task, but he thought that was maybe unnecessary. But isn't it interesting that when a vacuum is created, it gets filled? And the decline of religion has created an interesting church-shaped hole that is now being filled. And Father Tim Hopkins here, who is a humanist celebrant, who conducts marriages and funerals and hears confessions and confirms people. So I mean, it's fascinating that we're all reinventing the wheel here. Some of this will come up in the discussion. We're going to hear from each of the speakers for about 15 minutes in the first hour. There's then going to be a coffee break, and you can discuss the ideas amongst yourselves. It was decided by the management that it would be kind of awkward to do it in any other way. There's not really time to put you into groups. So it means you're going to have to do a fair bit of sitting and listening. But the order is going to be the hidden history uncovering the family resemblance between humanism and Christianity, and that'll be delivered by Liam Fraser on my extreme left, who is a minister in training and a specialist in Christian atheist relations. Then celebrating the one life we have, 10 years of humanist marriage, and that'll be Canon Tim Maguire, the humanist chaplain at Edinburgh University and a humanist celebrant. Forgive the sarcasm, Tim. The third talk, Can a Christian be a Humanist? Forging Progressive Alliances in a Troubled World? And that'll be Russell Moffat, who's a Church of Scotland minister at St. Martin's Parish in Edinburgh. And then finally, Historical Humanism and the Modern Movement, A Shared Journey, Gary McClelland, Policy and Public Affairs Officer of the Human Society of Scotland. Then the coffee break, then the panel will reconvene and they'll kind of discuss with each other the papers that have been delivered for about 15-20 minutes. Then we'll throw it open to the floor for question and answer, contributions and discussions. So I hope you're quite happy with that structure. It's the structure I've been given to steer, and it's probably the best one given that we've only got just over 2 hours. Welcome, and I invite Liam to kick off. Okay.
Now, I must begin this presentation today by disappointing a few of you. One might have assumed that a young minister organising and speaking at a conference on cooperation with humanists would be a progressive liberal Christian, ready to discard the supernatural elements of the Christian faith and embrace modernity with wide open arms. But that's not me. I'm an Orthodox Christian who affirms the historic creed of the Church. I affirm the authority of Scripture and the Holy Trinity. I affirm the incarnation, atonement, resurrection, and ascension of the Lord Jesus Christ. I affirm the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and the life everlasting. And it's because I affirm these things that I'm here today. Because I, like all Christians, am commanded by Christ to seek for reconciliation and peace where it may be found. And that is no more important than today. Because there are those both within the church and within the worlds of humanism and non-religion that want to see a perpetual tension between the two of us, who are happy to see us sleepwalk into a new sectarianism, yet this time not between Protestant and Catholic, but between the religious and the non-religious. And I don't want that. And so rather than spending the day going round in circles, I'm going to concede the major argument that humanists have against Christians from the word go. As a Christian, I don't want to have any privileges that place me or my faith above others. Nor, I believe, do any other Christians. And so when it appears that Christians are wishing to hold on to special privileges, I would suggest that a better explanation is this: that many Christians are not looking for privilege, but protection. That many Christians are feeling insecure and marginalized in today's post-Christian society, and are looking for some protection. And with this feeling of marginalization, exclusion, and insecurity, humanists should have some sympathy, because that has been the experience of many humanists over the past 100 years, and is the experience of many even today. So how do we get to this strange position where we all feel threatened and mistreated and marginalized by one another? And what intellectual resources, if any, can we uncover to repair our understanding of the relationship between humanism and Christianity? The answer, I argue, lies in history. And history teaches us 3 lessons vital for current dialogue. First, that because humanism grew out of Christianity, we share the same basic ethic. Second, that the current impasse between Christians and humanists is a relatively recent phenomenon. And third, and perhaps most importantly, that the attempt to deal with one's opponents through domination, marginalization, and public humiliation does not work, and only stores up trouble for later. For those who have learned about the Christian faith from popular culture or from new atheism, it's obvious that humanism, as a non-religious ethical culture, developed from the Enlightenment. So the story goes, the wicked priests and ministers of the church stifled the flame of freedom and science for centuries, mercilessly silencing the voice of reason so as to preserve their own power and their gloomy, life-denying worldview. This, unfortunately, is far from correct. The roots of humanism should not be sought in the mid to late 18th century, but instead in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, when Christianity was still in full bloom. The original humanism was a literary and textual movement among scholars, who at that time were mainly priests and monks. The original humanism sought to strip away centuries of theological commentary, church tradition, and papal pronouncement, and return to the pure text of the Bible itself, to let the Bible speak for itself. This approach soon bore fruit, as Martin Luther, John Calvin, and others, known to history as the Reformers, began to read Scripture for themselves, coming to the conclusion that many of the Church's traditions were without biblical support. It's their work that laid the foundations for the Scottish Reformation, which gave rise, in turn, to the Church of Scotland of today. The humanist movement also gave rise, of course, to desire to return to ancient texts and for a new appreciation of pagan literature and philosophy. Yet while the reading of such texts added a level of skepticism to some sections of educated thought, the origins of non-religion in Britain owe little to this strand of humanist thought. On the contrary, the first anti-Christian free thinkers in Britain, originating in late 17th century England, were not atheists or agnostics as we would now understand them, but were, surprisingly, hyper-Protestants. Protestants who, like the Reformers before them, came to the conclusion that the contemporary forms of Christianity in their day could not be derived from Scripture. In addition, the early free thought movement, as a theological and philosophical one, did not advance nor have as its focus any unique form of ethic that would directly connect it with modern-day humanism. The real origins of modern-day humanism lie in 19th century Britain. Now, while many humanist and free-thinking histories present an international account of the development of humanism and non-religion, it seems to me that this is misleading, discounting important principles of historical causation and ignoring the national and regional factors that gave British humanism its unique stamp. Unlike the humanism of Feuerbach, Strauss, and Marx, for example, which was specifically developed to overthrow and replace Christianity, British humanism developed naturally and largely non-violently from existing forms of Christian religiosity. There were three main 19th century influences that led to the development of British humanism, and all of them were religious in nature. The first was the older ethical society movement. This had grown out of liberal, non-Anglican Christianity, and although always small in numbers, had a distinctive ethos that survived into the 20th century. The second influence came from Unitarianism. Now, Unitarianism developed out of Orthodox Presbyterianism during the course of the 18th century, its major distinguishing feature being the belief that there was only one person in the Godhead, God the Father, rather than the three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, of Orthodox Trinitarian Christianity. During the course of the 19th century, Unitarians became increasingly liberal in their attitude towards Scripture and doctrine, and some drifted into the ethical movement and then later into the humanist movement. The third influence was from the positivism of Auguste Comte, a quasi-religious movement that T.H. Huxley once famously described as Catholicism without Christianity. Each of these influences represented a secularized form of Christianity, one that kept the moral and spiritual core of the faith, but discarded its supernatural husk. If one had asked the forebears of the current humanist movement in Britain whether they were religious or not, almost all of them would have answered with a most definite yes. It's only really since the Second World War that humanism has taken a more pronounced anti-religious tone and a more determined effort to put clear blue water between it and the church. The cause of this growing distance is somewhat unclear, but stems, I think, from three interrelated factors. The first was a growing confidence among humanists to speak their mind and challenge convention. Second, a growing distance, especially over matters of sexuality, between Christians and humanists. And third, the exasperation and anger that has accrued when one's ideas and beliefs are rejected and publicly insulted. This is certainly evident in the first major humanist controversy of the 20th century, surrounding the broadcast of Margaret Knight on the BBC. These marked a watershed in the history of humanism in Britain, and the angry reaction that they provoked from some sections of the church led to a hardening of positions on both sides. I would suggest, however, that the greatest factor in forming the recent disagreement among us comes from the controversial New Atheist movement. When everyone thinks of the cogency of New Atheist arguments, I think that New Atheist authors have been successful in two areas. The first is their attempt at consciousness raising among non-religious people, and encouraging this section of society to adopt a more positive identity, a more defined identity. The second area of success has been in prompting this constituency to abandon a policy of deference towards religious people and to challenge their role in public institutions and civil society. Yet this consciousness raising and the political and social agitation that has followed from it has produced a corresponding reaction within the Christian community, significant sections of which have become defensive and conservative in the face of marginalization from public life. As someone who has an interest in Protestant fundamentalism and six-day creationism, I've witnessed an upturn in both forms of Christian religiosity over the past decade, the edges of the church mirroring the intransigence of anti-Christian thought in surprising and alarming ways. If current patterns of church growth and church decline continue, the Scottish humanists of the future will be facing a smaller, yet far more intransigent and angry church. This very brief resume of the past relationship between humanists and Christians has revealed three things. First, that humanism grew out of Christianity. Now, negatively, this disproves the humanist argument that we have common values simply because we are human. On the contrary, all the historical evidence points to humanism as an offshoot of Western, and in particular Protestant Christianity, which explains why other world cultures, which are ultimately made up of human beings too, have a very different ethic from us. But positively, this shared ethic gives a solid foundation for mutual trust and respect, and also forms the basis for collaboration on a range of social justice issues. Second, the current impasse between Christians and humanists is a relatively recent phenomenon. We can only really speak of a serious divorce between humanism and Christianity since the Second World War, and even then, it's only really since New Atheism that humanism has grown more overtly inimical toward the public expression and institutionalization of religion. In this way, there's no essential reason why humanism and Christianity should be opposed to each other. And third, and I think most importantly for today, our historical resume has suggested that intolerance and a lack of empathy and respect towards one's opponents is counterproductive and only leads to social polarization, conflict, and extremism. You know, I get it. It can be tempting for non-religious people, now in the ascendancy within Scotland, to have little patience with religious folk. For those from a religious background, they will often believe that the poor morals or the faulty reasoning that prompted their escape from the faith is a necessary characteristic of all religion. And for those with no religious background, not having too much knowledge about religious people, it's easy to write them off in advance as backward, irrational bigots, and their practices and beliefs as weird, troubling, intolerable. Yet humanists too were once in that situation. And history suggests that the only way for lasting peace within public life is when the integrity and specific forms of life of religious people and minority views are respected and upheld. Extremism and fundamentalism, after all, are not the product of toleration and mutual respect, but of marginalization, mockery, and disrespect. And what that means for us today is this. Rather than pretending that we live in a purely secular society, or one that is or will be uniformly non-religious, it's a wiser counsel to admit the truth. We do not live in a secular society or a non-religious society, but a pluralist society with many different competing claims to truth. And this entails a pluralist solution to our current disagreement. Now, in the major flashpoint of education, a pluralist solution for peace means expanding provision for worship and religious instruction for children from religious families. The current practice of religious observance, while an appropriate foundation and very much to be welcomed, does not meet the specific spiritual needs of religious children or their families. The Scottish Government lists spiritual development as one of its aims of religious observance, but the attempt to find a common denominator among all faiths and none means that the specific traditions and specific spiritual needs of religious students and their families are not being met. If this is to be done, a more regular diet of worship and religious instruction should be offered within school. Now, such provision could be made either by allowing schools to opt in for an extra diet of worship or more religious content, or alternatively, allowing an extra diet of worship and religious instruction for children from religious families. If either of these became a reality, the need for appointed religious representatives on councils, which I believe is a major bone of contention between us, would, I believe, disappear, as religious communities would have the educational protections they feel necessary to balance the weight of non-religious influences upon their children. While not a definitive legal argument, the fact that the UN Declaration on Human Rights and the European Convention on Human Rights both recognise an obligation on the state to educate children in conformity with the religious wishes of their parents, thus present an added moral argument for such an accommodation, especially when it would not involve any serious cost to the state. If religious parents can respect the right of non-religious parents to educate their children free from religion, I think it's only reasonable that non-religious parents can return the favour. In a situation where none of us, and I really mean none of us, can decisively prove to one another that our own moral view is correct, we should be charitable to one another and give each other the benefit of the doubt, especially when it will bring lasting peace between us. And it's here, in relation to the education system, in relation to the one area where we argue the most, in the negotiation over perceived Christian privilege and perceived humanist aggression, that we might see, unexpectedly and hesitantly, an opportunity for mutual aid and improvement, that we might help each other to be better Christians and better humanists. For in challenging Christian privilege, humanists remind the Church that its proper place in life, like Christ himself, is not to reside in power and privilege, but in humility. And in reminding humanists of their origins within the Church and the way in which the humanist movement and its core beliefs are as relative and context-bound as anything else in this world, Christians remind humanists that theirs is not the default or the neutral position, but that humanists, like the Church itself, know in part and believe in part. It is in this mutual service that humanists and Christians can help one another to stay grounded and humble, and without that hubris that is the enemy of faith and reason alike. Thank you.
Tim.
Thank you, Richard. Can I begin by thanking all of you for turning up on a Saturday morning? It's beautiful out there. What on earth are you doing in here? I also want to thank Scott McKenna from Mayfield Parish Church, who was the person who first asked me to come and be part of this conversation. He went off with his flock to Lindisfarne instead. But it's great. We don't often have a chance to have conversations like this, so I'm very grateful for the opportunity. But the title of the event's interesting: Humanism and Christianity, Friends and Foes. I think, as the Archbishop of Canterbury recently said, we should stop pretending that all religions agree, even just Christian ones. There's a big elephant in the room today. We have an Episcopalian, we have people from the Church of Scotland, we have some humanists. We don't have any Catholics in this conversation. Do we have any Methodists? Do we have any Unitarians? Do we have any Greek Orthodox? I could go on. Any wee freeze? Is David Robertson hiding somewhere up the back of the building? So the idea that we should make out that Christianity is united in its thought is ultimately dishonest, because there are profound differences in the way that Christians believe and the outworking of their faith. And here I am quoting Justin Welby. It says, true friendship and relationships can withstand honesty about differences in values and opinions, and a common commitment to mutual flourishing in adversity. Or as David Hume said some centuries ago, the truth arises from disagreements among friends. I hope we will be friends today. Controversy, however, is what gives us headlines. I remember a few years ago there was a meeting billed between Richard Dawkins and the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, and it was called High Noon in Oxford. And what they were looking for was a huge bust-up, a big rammy. And I remember Dawkins said that actually he was sort of only a 7 out of 8 agnostic, and he sings hymns in the shower sometime, quite like Christmas. And the Archbishop said that he thought some of Dawkins' ideas were rather good. And they got on like a house on fire. Then that is not a headline you're ever going to see in a newspaper. So controversy is what people like to report. Agreement is not. I thought today what I would do is talk about being a celebrant. I don't know if any of you have been to humanist ceremonies, but I've spent the last 10 years either burying people or marrying them, not usually in that order, occasionally naming their children, and for the last little while I've also been the first ever humanist chaplain at the University of Edinburgh. My background before that, well, my name is Tim Maguire. In Scotland, that would give you a clue to my upbringing, wouldn't it? It's an Irish name. I was brought up a Catholic. And when I was brought up, there were basically only two kinds of good, blue and green. And if you're green, they were wrong. And if you're blue, they were wrong. And I was about 14 when I realized that the Pope and I were going to fall out pretty soon over the issue of sex. So I became a lapsed Catholic. And after that, I think I became what you might call a recovering Catholic. And it took me a very, very long time before I stumbled across humanism and realized that actually the idea that you could lead a good and worthwhile life without God was something that had never actually been mentioned to me at all at school. And do you know something? It's still not. Nobody I meet has ever been taught or told about humanism during their education because it's not an option. So what do we have in common between people of faith and none? Well, I think the thing that we all value most of all is love. And when I was training as a celebrant, I remember Mary Wallace, who trained me and most of my colleagues then, said that the one part of the New Testament that we were kind of allowed to have in a humanist ceremony, where we don't do religious content, was Corinthians 13. And the reason for that is that it says there are three things will abide: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of all these is love. And that, if you like, and love is a very small word for a very big thing. It covers everything from agape, through to passion. But I think that is what we have in common, and that's what we talk about in humanist ceremonies. It's really the most interesting thing. We agree on love, but actually the difficulty with religions and humanism is that if you're religious, you'll disagree with me about who's allowed to love who. We'll come back to that later. Why do people choose to have humanist ceremonies? Well, when I meet couples who want to get married, the first thing they say to me is, well, we're not religious, but. I meet probably in the course of 10 years, I think I've met 3 couples who actually thought they were humanists. Most people they're not that bothered. They aren't religious, but they want to have a ceremony that's got meaning. And they want to celebrate life and love in their own words. And that's what we do in humanist ceremonies. We speak in normal language. And if I'm marrying people, I'm speaking in their language because I make the people I marry write their own ceremonies. The difference, I think, between the way we talk about love and the way people do in Christian ceremonies is that in a humanist ceremony, it's coming from the specific, from the individuals whose lives we're talking about, and that is universal. We can all relate to that. In a religious ceremony, we tend to talk about love and the love of God in a more universal way, which perhaps is slightly less immediate and less powerful. But what is interesting about humanist ceremonies is that they've actually changed society. Now, 10 years ago, when humanist marriage became legal in June 2015, I think the very first year there were 48 marriages. And I remember when I was doing my first funerals, people didn't actually know the word humanist. I was standing outside once, and this couple of old boys came out, and one of them was saying, "I didn't care why they cried them humorous funerals. The boy wasn't that funny." And since then, people have got used to the idea of a humanist funeral. At the beginning, people would say, "Can I have a word?" And they'd draw me aside and say, "Is it all right if I say, I quite enjoyed that ceremony?" And now people realize that actually they are uplifting, and it's an extraordinary thing. We talk about celebrating life. Humanists believe we've only got one life, and actually it's a really good idea to wake up and celebrate the fact that we have it. And when someone dies, we celebrate the life as well as mourning the death. But I think even in the most tragic cases, the extraordinary thing is that something of that celebration still survives. I've done a few funerals in the last 6 months where I've had really tragic deaths. People have died before their time, motorcycle accidents, falling off mountains, and I've said, usually we talk about the celebration of life, but today we're not going to do that because your grief is too raw, your pain is too fresh. But we will talk about the person, and then we do that. And I've had phone calls, I've had letters from people saying that was so uplifting. And that is a hugely rewarding feeling to have, that despite the fact this is tragic, we can somehow be united in the love of somebody and feel better about it. And that's really what we aim to do. Now, the attraction of a humanist wedding is that you are free to say in your own words why you're doing what you're doing. And as a celebrant, if you're getting married in a religious tradition, you'll meet someone who's marrying you and they'll instruct you. I don't do that. I don't presume to tell you what to think about marriage. I don't presume to tell you what love means either. What I do is I ask people to go away and think what love means to them and what marriage means to them, and then tell you, because that is why we are here. Because in marriage, the reason that humanist marriage has become popular, quite simply, is that it allows people to define what marriage means to them. As an institution, marriage has been going down off a cliff since the Second World War. In Scotland, 4 years ago, it began to go back up again, because the only form of marriage that's actually increasing is humanist marriage. And that is because people are prepared to invest in an institution if it means something to them. Most people have children out of wedlock because they don't really want the baggage that comes with marriage as it used to be. But when you can say what marriage means to you in your own words, you actually define marriage and you change the nature of the institution. And I think that is the real reason people choose to have humanist weddings. Now, there's about 110 working celebrants in Scotland. 65% of them are women. Last year we did about 3,000 funerals, did slightly more weddings. This year we expect to do 3,500 weddings. And if that's true, we prophesied, no we didn't, we predicted statistically that this would be the year in which our marriages overtake those of the Church of Scotland. Now that will be very interesting. 10 years ago, unheard of. Now in a position where humanist marriage is more popular than that of the Kirk which embodied for such a long time everything that Scotland was about. So I think that's significant. Marriage is one of the issues that we disagree about, and just the other day on Facebook I saw, Facebook's a great place for finding little things that are useful. Marriage these days is not about religion. Civil marriage is the most popular form of marriage there is. Actually, it's a legal institution, and atheists obviously marry. Marriage is not about procreation. Infertile people marry. Old people who are past childbearing age marry. Marriage is not about money. Marriage survives poverty. What marriage is love. And that is all. And that is beautiful. Now, since the end of last year, we've conducted same-sex marriage. The Kirk doesn't allow same-sex marriage. I think we'll talk about that later. There's been some interesting manoeuvres in the General Assembly in the last week. The Catholic Church doesn't do same-sex marriage. In Northern Ireland, they won't even bake a cake about same-sex marriage. The Irish referendum results are due out today. I think we're going to see in Ireland that 80% of the population are voting to introduce same-sex marriage there. Now, that is an extraordinary thought in a country which so recently was dominated by Catholic belief. Finally, if I have time, I'd like to speak a little bit about what humanism means to me. There are two people I like who've spoken about it better than me. Philip Pullman, the author of Northern Lights and the other two books in that trilogy, and Jim Al-Khalili, the scientist who's the current president of the British Humanist Association. Philip Pullman says, there are values that I hope you share, whether you're a humanist or not. Tolerance, justice, rationality, intellectual curiosity, and so on. He says, humanists often put reason at the head of the queue in their list of virtues, and of course it is important, but I believe that compassion and kindness are far more so. And I believe David Hume said, reason is and always shall be the slave of the passions. And what neuroscience now shows us is that actually, if it wasn't for our emotions, reason would not exist at all. From the perspective of the brain, Homo sapiens is the most emotional animal of all. We need to love before we can think. Pullman also says, I think it matters more what you do than what you think. Doing something good for a bad reason is better than doing something bad for a good one. But when you say that your belief entitles you to throw people in prison or to kill them for believing something different, that is when it is dangerous. Now, Jim Al-Khalili has a working definition of humanism, which I like as well. He says, I think humanism's fate and future is in its own hands. And the reason I strive for a better world and I try to be a better person is not because scripture or mythology tells me to do so, and that I'll be rewarded for being good and punished for being bad. The reason I do that is because being good defines me as a human being. And anybody who wants to be good because they think they should be, and not because their religion tells them to me, is a humanist. I think I could probably stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. And Russell Moffat goes next on Can a Christian be a Humanist? Forging Progressive Alliances in a Troubled World.
How are you doing? Surviving? Faint but following, are you? After 2 presentations already. Right, can a Christian be a humanist? Well, it depends how you define Christian and how you define humanist. The Chinese have a proverb that the beginning of wisdom is calling things by their proper names, which sounds great, but that doesn't really help as much, does it? Because every label you can think of, you can define very differently. Liam put his cards on the table about the type of Christian he is. I am a very different Christian, and although I'm sitting to the right of him, I'm actually very much to the left of him. So how would I self-identify? Well, this week, I identify as a progressive Protestant existentialist. Try saying that after a few glasses of wine. Let me unpack that. And I say this week because it was said of the famous historian A.J.P. Taylor, in fact, he said it of himself, that he held extreme views very weakly, and that's why he was very changeable. I can identify with that. Firstly, a Protestant. I don't mean by denomination, obviously I'm in the Church of Scotland, but I just mean by heart and soul. I'm a rebel. When the late Christopher Hitchens said at the Usher Hall a few years ago, I might be an atheist, but I'm very definitely a Protestant atheist, I think we knew what he meant. I better balance that up by saying that Dara O'Brien says that, he's an atheist, he's also a Catholic atheist, because the Catholic Church won't let him go. You know, I'm an atheist, yeah, but you're one of our boys. So when I say Protestant, I mean it in the sense of my inclination and my attitude to things. I'm a bit of a rebel. And of course, Protestants were exactly that. They were rebels. It has been said that the Enlightenment motto was dare to think for yourself. And postmodernism has a motto, says who, and that says S-E-Z. I think both of these sentiments are found in the Reformation. Dare to think for yourself. And says who. Which brings me, I think, to the second part, a progressive Protestant. In many ways, the Reformation was about a continuing process. It wasn't meant to be a one-off. Unfortunately, once the genie of freedom gets out of the bottle, then you get people trying to control things. And certainly, I think not only did the Roman Catholic Church look at on in horror at the fragmentation of Christendom after the Protestant Reformation, but I think some of the Protestant leaders ended up thinking, oh shit, what have we done? Because as soon as you give individuals freedom and you allow people to interpret the scriptures their way without the authority of the church, then you get a whole spectrum of beliefs. You get those in the centre that are moderate and maybe sensible, but then you get both sides of the extremes on left and right as well, and that certainly happened after the Reformation. So how was that controlled? Well, of course, it was controlled in large extent by the clergy and also, of course, by the princes and the rulers, because democracy, as we know it, didn't exist at that time. Max Weber talks about religion as having two components. There are the charismatics and the bureaucrats. Charismatics are those who found religions or who renew them and reform them, and then the bureaucrats are those who like control. And I suppose without organisation and control, you can get absolute chaos that ends up in even the best of intentions falling flat on their face. There is a saying that revolutions are dreamt up by thinkers and carried out by bandits, and there's a certain element of truth when you look at history. So the Protestant Reformation was about the individual being able to challenge authority, to interpret the scriptures on their own, and certainly that opened a can of worms. But the Protestant church has also had its papacies. We don't like the idea of a pope, but liberal Protestantism has been called dependent on the papacy of professors, because it's all very well having the ideal that the ploughboy can learn to read and write and then read the Bible for himself. But when he does that, he then starts to say, oh, well, I think the Bible's saying this. And those in authority say, well, no. Let's instruct you here. It's the experts. It's those who have the education who will tell you what that's about. Well, that comes back again to a certain form of authority. And then, of course, in right-wing Protestantism, you have the papacy of pastors, who are some of these independent churches that are founded by some charismatic preacher. He rules it with a rod of iron and with a fist of iron in many cases as well. And that has been one of the problems. So I'm a progressive Protestant in the sense that I like the freedom to be able to question and to test things. Now, I live in my age. I don't live in the world of the Bible writers. I don't live at the time of the church fathers. I don't even live at the time of the reformers. I live in the modern age. And for me, faith is a journey. It's a development. I remember at Greenbelt a number of years ago, Caspar Melville, who was the editor at the time of the New Humanist magazine, gave a talk. And for me, it was the best talk at Greenbelt. If you don't know what Greenbelt is, it's a Christian arts festival. And it's quite broad range. You get all types of Christians there, and you always have atheists and humanist speakers as well. But he was quite bemused by the fact that everybody he spoke to at Greenbelt, when he asked them about their faith or their Christianity, they all said, oh, well, I'm on a journey. And he thought this was quite interesting. But what's wrong with that? We're on a journey. I'm a pilgrim. I don't have answers. My faith, for me, gives me pointers. And it points me towards engagement with the modern world. If I can give you some illustrations here. Think of a bird. A bird can fly, but if you stick it in a cage, it's imprisoned. For me, that's fundamentalism. A balloon can fly, but if you let it go, you watch it disappear. That's liberalism. I want to think of a kite that has tremendous ability to maneuver, and the person controlling the kite can have a lot of leeway in the way he flies that kite, but it's tethered. And that's how I see my faith. In a sense, changing the metaphor, I'm an amphibian. I inherit two worlds. One is the tradition that I'm part of, the Christian story, and the other is the modern world in all its wonderful glory. I am so pleased I live today, because if I had lived long ago, I probably would have been burned at the stake. Well, that's not true. I'm a coward, so I probably wouldn't have never put my head above the parapet. But I love being able to question things. And maybe the problem here is organisation. You have organised religion, you have organised humanism. And Stephen Laws, in his little book on humanism, draws that distinction. That those who organise themselves contemporaneously as humanists do so as secular humanists, as atheists, or at the very least agnostics. And of course, organised religion has its creeds and its confessions of faith. And we need organisations, because without that, human beings need a certain degree of organised work to make things happen. But we should remember that the boundaries are not meant to be a prison. And Stephen Laws talks about broad-based humanism, which is outside of the organised humanism. And that's where I would say my humanism is. That as a Christian, how could I not be a humanist? Because when we think of what Jesus is like, and we think of the concept of human flourishing, well, of course, to me, the two go hand in hand. And two wee pointers that I find quite hopeful. There was a guy called Martin Gardner who died in 2010. Now, Martin was one of the founders of the Skeptical Society in the United States. And had a lot of kudos for that. And he was nominated for a secular humanist award because of his work towards the Skeptical Society. He had to turn it down because he didn't self-identify as a secular humanist. He was a theist, a philosophical theist. And all his friends had forgotten that because they saw the great work that he did and then thought, why, but you're one of these weird folk that you actually believe in God. Now, to me, that's a hopeful sign that the fact he was a theist did not stop him being open-minded and involved in the Skeptical Society in the States. And the second wee hopeful pointer is Richard Dawkins wearing a T-shirt a number of years ago, Atheists for Jesus. Now, I'm sure, because religious folk get offended by lots of things, sure there was somebody somewhere was offended by that. I thought it was really cool. And to me, I want to say to atheists, yeah, I think this guy, Jesus, who's my hero, Bob Dylan, who's another hero of mine, did a concert in Australia a few years ago, and he said, I want to sing a song about my hero. And of course, it was a song about Jesus. Well, I would identify with that. Now, there are going to be differences between us. That's great. But at the end of the day, organised religion and organised humanism can get on with what they do, but there has to be a meeting of minds, because I think there's loads of folk outside the church walls and outside humanist membership who have a broad range of things. And if the type of society we want to see is one where human flourishing takes place and where human rights are upheld, then we've got to work together. I am appalled at my church denomination on its attitude toward same-sex. My session had to discuss one of the things passed down by the General Assembly a couple of years ago. There wasn't even a discussion in the session. Why are we even discussing this? Nobody had a problem with it. Anyway, that's my. So I'm a Protestant within my own denomination, speaking out on these things. But that's the problem with organisations and organised anything. But I think there's a free spirit. Human beings are good at the free spirit. If we can nurture that, we can fight and stand up against what I think are dangers in the future. I think the wonderful freedom we have is fragile. And I think everybody should work for the common good. Stephen Jay Gould, who was one of my heroes again, I love him on evolution. And he talked about scientists needing to extend the hand of friendship across the divide to religious people for the greater good. And I'm willing to do that with humanists for the greater good. And by the way, contrary to Liam, I don't need protection from atheism or secularism. I can stand up for myself, and I think Christians always have. And I think we had a privileged position and we abused it, so we're just getting the just desserts for previous attitudes and actions. But I think we can take care of ourselves, so we don't need protected. Anyway, I think that's enough. I shall stop there.
Thank you. And now Gary's going to talk on historical humanism and the modern movement. Where is he?
Is this all that there is? That's a question that I'm invariably asked whenever I speak publicly on humanism or secularism or atheism. And I'm just going to put it out there just so that we can sort of mull it over the next 10-15 minutes. Richard, our distinguished chair at the start of today's event, said that he hoped there isn't going to be too much agreement. So in the 10 or 15 minutes I've got, I'd like to take him up on that challenge and start off by saying there are two types of people. There are those who look around in the world and they see that this wretched, imperfect, impure, harsh, hard environment can't be all there is. There must be something immaterial, something beyond it, something transcendent that has more meaning and more purpose behind it. And that there are various ways in which we can try and access this transcendent spiritual dimension through gods, demons, deities, spiritualism, various different methods. And then there are another type of people who look around and they see the majesty of science, of nature, the beauty all around us, the camaraderie, the common shared experiences and the love, and they see that that is enough and that there is much more wonder and much more enchantment in the world to find out how it works rather than to search for something which is never going to be achieved. And where I would like to disagree with Liam is that it's my contention that there has been, since there have been groups of humans, there has always been those two types. I don't think modern humanism evolved from Renaissance Christianity or Renaissance Protestantism. I firmly believe that insofar as there have been meetings of minds, there have been humanists, or those who try to embody a humanist life stance. And we do have evidence for this. We have evidence from, I've just returned from a trip to Athens in Greece, where I was at a meeting of European humanist organisations, about 29 from all different EU member states and wider Council of Europe countries, Russia, Poland, various different interesting people. And I was lucky enough to spend some time about Greece, learning about the Athenian democracy, about all the different amazing things that were going on in Greece. Thousands of years before we had Christianity, never mind Renaissance Christianity. And the democracy that the Athenians managed to create was in many, many ways much more sophisticated than anything that we can claim to call democracy today. They did get one thing wrong, which was the issue of equality. They enfranchised only wealthy males. But then, if we look around our society today, it's already been touched on about the Church of Scotland's approach to same-sex couples. We are still struggling with many, many aspects of equality in this culture, so let's not chastise them too heavily. We also had in India and China, Confucius, Buddha, many different people who tried to embody this view of a world, of a way of being, of a life stance that is about the here and now, that's about trying to make sense of the world as we see it, without trying to find refuge in spiritualism or some imagined other place that can embody some sort of sense of pure principles. And various different philosophers throughout the ages have tried to lay this down, this intellectual, conceptual framework for how to live your life as someone who thinks that this life is the one that we have and the one that we should spend our time trying to develop. So it's my contention that, contrary to what Lehman Russell say, that the origins of humanism stretch far, far, far beyond the Enlightenment or the Renaissance. But it has to be said that the modern day movement does take a lot of teachings, not only from the ancient Greeks and ancient Europeans, but also from the Renaissance movement. People like Erasmus and More are very much what we would conceptually think about as humanists in the way that they approach life and in the way they try to expand the current knowledge of how we live and how we think and how we move along with one another. But those people, as you will probably know, were very definitely Christians and not what we would associate with modern day humanism. An interesting distinction. It's not really until the Enlightenment in Europe where we see the revival of what was set down by the ancient people as being a modern, not necessarily, but often godless way of envisaging the humanist principles in life. We have empiricism, skepticism, and it's at this time that we start to see the emergence of atheism as not only a godless, but an anti-religious point of view, and one that takes rejection of doctrines, of religion, of godliness to be quite a serious part of its philosophy. Moving on then to the 19th century, people like John Stuart Mill set down very interesting tracts about how we can search for the common good, how we can build the just society, how we can try to rationalise how we get along with one another and try and build that open society that the ancient Greeks in many ways tried to set down before us. It's in 1860 that the word humanist was first used in the way that we and humanist organisations use it today to mean a godless worldview based on the flourishing of human beings. The 19th century was also very important for the godless movement because Darwin, for the first time, was able to give an intellectual coherence to a gap which existed in scientific knowledge, i.e. evolution. How could we have the majesty of different creatures and beings on this planet without there being some sort of plan, some sort of overarching deity? Well, Darwin began the process which we now understand of there being natural selection and evolution, etc., etc. As Liam correctly pointed out, the 20th century saw the movement and expansion of what were called ethical societies. Many of these ethical societies were Methodist churches, other forms of very liberal interpretations of Christianity, who basically just left the God bit behind. They evolved beyond the point of needing there to be any doctrine, any spirituality, but they kept the buildings, they kept the congregations, they kept, for some of them, they kept the priests and the ministers. And if you look hard enough, you can actually find reports, recommendations and minutes to the Church of England that they themselves should become the National Ethical Society and just give up on the God stuff. Perhaps something for next year's General Assembly, gentlemen. So yes, there have been evolutions and crossed paths between the various different strands of Christianity and humanism. But as I said at the start, I think they still embody two incredibly different, sometimes overlapping, but incredibly different worldviews. In the 21st century, Humanism is now a global movement of hundreds of member countries, hundreds of local branches, people, individuals, organisations, authors, artists, scientists, who want to lend their support to this idea that we can build an open, just society, that we can build on the work of the ancient Greeks, of the Renaissance Christians, and take this further, and that we can work together to try and make a world that individual human progress is at the heart of what we do. So I wanted to touch briefly on the question which to me seems to be at the heart of today's conversation, which is, can a Christian be a humanist, or vice versa? Well, I'm not sure that one can, because for me, if you take the humanist principles to be about human happiness, human striving, in the face of all else, that is the most important principle, there seems to me no room for God, that God cannot exist within that intellectual framework. And also, if you reverse it, I think the same is true. But that's obviously not the case in practice. Richard Holloway has done more to advance humanist principles than I have ever done in Scotland. I'm quite comfortable with that. So it's obviously not the case that despite my intellectual unhappiness with that situation, that Christians and humanists do inhabit a common world. There is common ground between us. And I'm going to try and stick to my principle of creating some disagreement by saying that that common ground only exists in the material universe that we inhabit today. It only exists on the humanist turf. That's where the common ground lies. And Christians and other people, theists, deists, whatever, are welcome to join us, but that is where the common ground lies. It doesn't lie in an imagined spiritual dimension. It doesn't lie in intellectual or spiritual, transcendent versions of this world. It lies only here and now in the lives that we have today. There's a nice quote that I prepared from Rousseau, which says, "Men always have what is good or what they find good. It is in the judging of the good that they go wrong." And I think to me that is what sums up the common ground that exists between humanists and religious people, Christians, is that we can come together and we can work for freedom of expression, we can work for equality, we can work for the common good of the people that live around about us, but it's only in appreciating that these virtues and these important aspects of our human experience exist in the here and now in the physical universe. I'll touch briefly on education before I sum up. Like Tim McClelland, you can probably guess my background. I'm the grandson of Irish immigrants to the west of Scotland, and I attended a Catholic school, state-funded Catholic school in Scotland not that long ago. And in that school I was taught that I come from a tradition of the Catholic tradition, that we are a persecuted people in this country. Don't put the school that you went to on your CV because people won't give you a job. Various other things like that. This happens nowadays. And where I would like to take an issue with Liam's point that we should be more generous in allowing different aspects of religion and belief into our schools is that I want to say that when I was a child, I didn't have access to the vast pantheon of ancient philosophies and Greek tracts on life. I learned what I was taught at school, and what I was taught at school is that you come from a Catholic background, you will learn these Catholic traditions and these Catholic faith points of view, and that's what you will do. It wasn't until I left school and I was able to sort of challenge those views and experience other philosophies that I realised that I actually reject that I don't think it's something which should be intellectually respected, and I don't think it's something which I want to embody myself in my life. So what I want us to be very aware of is that children have rights. Children have rights to a philosophically neutral education, to be exposed to a whole range of different ideas, and I think that by adopting the religion or belief of their parents and simply putting them into some sort of stream within mainstream school isn't the approach that we should be advocating. We know from the darker days of sectarianism in Scotland that division is not good. Division causes problems. So what we don't want to do is cause further division within schools. So anyway, that's my appeal to you. Working for the Humanist Society of Scotland and being part of the European and worldwide movement of humanists is an incredibly rewarding experience. It's something which constantly finds surprises and things to reflect on, things like being part of the campaign for marriage equality, talking to colleagues over in Ireland today who, and by the way, just a quick update, the No campaign have conceded, so it looks like about 4 o'clock today, and we will now have marriage equality in Ireland as well, which is not only to be welcomed, but also a profound point of reflection for the state of the Roman Catholic Church in that country. So being part of that campaign for marriage equality, being part of the campaign to try and improve education through making it more philosophically neutral, more open, transparent and inclusive, standing up for human rights as part of international movements, standing up with colleagues from different points of view for freedom of expression, freedom of belief, freedom of conscience, defending that, working with colleagues who have been trying to defend the atheist bloggers in Bangladesh, all these different things which I'm privileged to do on behalf of the Human Society of Scotland and other international partners is something which touches me greatly and gives me a profound sense of pride in what I do. So when people ask me, is this all there is? I simply reply, is this not enough? Thank you.